Hey all, Scott here. 3D is the future yesterday. And I'm not referring to 2D 3D, I'm referring to 3D 3D. Pretty realistic, huh? I'll take that as a yes.
Look out, it's right in front of you!
Oh God!
3D, a gimmick I have to check the meter to comment on.
Who gives a shit?
Every few decades, it goes in and out of fashion, primarily being used in movie theaters to sell more expensive tickets. Wow, it's like I'm really there. That's f***ed up. Pop the glasses on and you're transported to a world of layers. It can be a pretty cheap effect, but it can add to some experiences, and honestly, video games seem to be the perfect medium for the gimmick. Stereoscopic 3D allows you to better judge depth of field or have something pop out at you, which could greatly improve numerous titles. Plus, video games were already being advertised as immersive adventures, so adding 3D to the mix just flat out made sense. To which many would say, well, yeah, of course, the Nintendo 3DS released in 2011 featuring a screen that could display 3D visuals without the need of glasses. There was a lot that led to that moment.
Believe me.
But before we get too deep, keep in mind, stereoscopic 3D flickers a bunch. If you have a sensitivity to flashing images or experience epilepsy, anything like that, this whole 3D gaming talk may not be for you, so keep that in mind. 3D gaming can be traced all the way back to a little arcade game from 1982 titled Sub-Rock 3D, created by Sega. An arcade machine with a pair of goggles mounted directly in front of the screen. Sega, they gave us Sonic and Pink Eye. It's a naval combat game, which, hey, if any game makes sense to incorporate a periscope that doubles as a pair of 3D glasses, it's this one. It does actually feel like you're controlling the artillery of a submarine this way, and as a bonus, you see some depth with the stereoscopic 3D. However, this was only possible in the arcades. Sub-Rock 3D did get a ColecoVision release in the homes, but only a Sub-Rock without any 3D effect. And this allowed me to reflect on some personal choices of mine.
I f***ed up.
Without the 3D, this game was entirely disposable, which definitely proved a point early on here. 3D should enhance an already great game, not be the entire point of its existence. I think being in the arcades does lend a game like this to be more of a cheap gimmick. When it comes to at-home play, however, I feel that there's some potential. These games have to be longer lasting, no one-and-dones. So if they supported 3D, who knows, we might find ourselves a killer app for stereoscopic gaming.
I have a lot of hope for what happens in 1982.
Here we have the Vectrex, the future of gaming.
Wow, that's fucking bleak.
I don't care what anybody says, this is one of the coolest gaming oddities. It's basically a miniature TV with a controller built in, displaying vector graphics, which aren't pixelated. They're simple, but perfectly smooth at the same time. There's truly nothing else like it. It's something you have to see to believe in person, because no matter who you are, you'll at least think it looks kinda neat. But what would make it look kinda neater is the Vectrex 3D Imager, the first pair of 3D glasses created for a home video game. Portable video Vectrex. Each 3D Vectrex game comes with a color wheel that you insert into the headset and spins while playing. Side note, mine came stained. It's kind of funny how the Vectrex out of all consoles was the first to have an accessory like this, considering how the display was black and white. You'd have to lather these overlays on it to even get a hint of the stuff. But to make this work for 3D, the headset is where you put the overlay, and it spins it around to alternate colors, making the graphics appear to have depth. Supposedly. Yeah, I have 3D Crazy Coaster here, one of the few 3D Vectrex titles. I guess this is supposed to be a roller coaster simulator for f***ing robots! Yeah, for me personally, the 3D Imager doesn't really add a whole lot of depth to the image. It more so just makes it viewable to me. But this helped to lay the groundwork for 3D gaming at home, and should be respected for that. Making a 3D headset for a black and white vector graphic based console in 1982? That takes guts and methamphetamine. But in 1987, all it took was the latter. The Famicom 3D system by Nintendo. Yep, 3D gameplay on the Japanese version of what we got over here as the NES, the Famicom. Oh my god, this is such a sleek, futuristic accessory. What did we get over here in North America? A really bad shopping list. So we never got a full-blown official 3D gaming accessory for the NES over here. Any game that had a 3D mode, you would just use the typical paper glasses for. These were the reason why I never understood 3D branded technology being so much more expensive back then. Why are they expecting me to pay thousands more for a feature Spy Kids gave out for free? Well, have you tried playing Rad Racer in 3D? He did. The Famicom 3 headset is far more advanced. It plugs into the system and conveys a much stronger and more stable stereoscopic effect than what you'd get with a standard pair of paper glasses. But that's like saying this corpse is stronger than this one. So this headset uses a style of stereoscopic 3D possible by active shutters. Basically, the gameplay flickers between two images, in which each lens of the headset will exclusively show each eye one of the two, which creates a 3D effect. Now, you're probably wondering how good the 3D effect is on 8-bit games from the 1980s. So that's why society is crumbling. Well, I have a couple of compatible games right here. There weren't many, only 7, and only one of them was made by Nintendo themselves. Famicom Grand Prix 2 3D Hot Rally, an entry in a series you could consider to be a precursor to Mario Kart. To enable the 3D mode in most of these games, you just hit the select button and wow, you're transported to the same damn game you were playing before. It's just harder to see now. So the 3D works. In a game like 3D Hot Rally, I can clearly see that the car's in the foreground with the other elements in the background, but it is a very weak effect. It's there, but I have yet to play any Famicom game where the 3D enhances the experience and doesn't hinder it. Take, for example, this game, Falcyon. Everybody knows Falcyon.
Okay, well, not the morgue.
This is a space shooter played from the perspective of behind the ship, which is rare for games of this era. It works fairly well in 2D. However, in 3D, I just get a whole lot of double vision. Maybe it's my eyes, the TV I'm using, the age of the 3D headset. I don't know, because apparently this game is considered by some to have some of the best 3D on the system, though I cannot see how people would think it's necessary. This game, alongside all the others, works much better in 2D. The 3D is a cute little gimmick, but only for a second. Then after that, you ask yourself the fabled question:
why?
While the Famicom 3D system works, it doesn't add anything to these games other than a very slight feeling of depth. But if anything, it makes them harder to play due to the constant flickering and awkward headset. With the goggles on, it's like I'm playing the game with sunglasses. Everything's darker, and with the glasses using active shutters and the game flickering back and forth, the 3D may work most of the time, but it's always going to be a much clearer and easier experience playing in 2D. And the only games released for the thing were either just racers or shooters, and if they came over to North America, they included paper glasses in the package, which didn't work as well, but for how little the Famicom 3D system enhanced the experience, I think these were a fine substitute. Needless to say, the Famicom 3D system flopped. Only 7 games, none of which were the most compelling and only covered like 2 genres. The 3D effect, while there, wasn't good enough to warrant setting up the headset to play every time and investing in a whole ass accessory like this. Yep, I'm putting my foot down with the whole Famicom 3D system debate. Damn, Scott's just gonna say that in the open just like that?
Nope.
Well, Nintendo wasn't the only video game company pushing 3D in the home at the time. We're cycling back over to Sega, who released this, the Sega 3D glasses for the Sega Master System. In terms of how it works, remember this? Yeah, these function in pretty much the same way. However, the game lineup is far more impressive. There are 8 games. While Nintendo dipped their toe into 3D, Sega threw their whole ass ankle into it. There's so much more variety in the games that supported the feature, plus the Sega 3D glasses released outside of Japan, which says a lot. That's correct, we had the right to play Zaxxon in 3D. Damn, it's good to live in Ohio. And yeah, I'd say these were a far better value than the Nintendo equivalent.
I angered them.
Moving into the 1990s, 3D wasn't attempted nearly as much on a consumer level. Most projects that were being developed never saw the light of day, like Sega Vr for the Sega Genesis. I mean, the PlayStation 4 can barely do virtual reality. It needs a whole ass this to be plugged in. You expected the Sega Genesis to be able to hold its own? However, Nintendo pulled through.
They did it. They f***ed up!
The Virtual Boy was Nintendo's second attempt at stereoscopic 3D gaming. We know that because it has the blood of its elders' victims on it. This was cobbled together because Nintendo kept delaying the release of the Nintendo 64 and needed a body. So out comes an unfinished game system simply meant to keep store shelves warm, and a 3D game system at that. See, the Virtual Boy being all about 3D from the get-go rather than simply being relegated to an add-on helped give us some of the most inventive and innovative applications of 3D gaming yet. It's also the Virtual Boy. Visuals restricted to a red and black color palette. Burgundy wasn't returning their calls. Awkward design that invited you to confuse your neighbors across the street. The Virtual Boy was one of the biggest busts in all of gaming. but that doesn't mean it didn't have value. The specs here allowed for far more types of 3D games rather than just shoot or drive. We got platformers focusing on hopping between the foreground and background, a first-person survival horror game, puzzle games, boxing, tennis, golf, baseball, fishing, Waterworld. While 3D gaming was far from necessary for most, if not all of these games and genres as a whole, the Virtual Boy helped show how 3D could potentially enhance them. Being able to judge where everything in the environment is in relation to the golfer, being immersed in a world of horror, not being able to look away like you could with a TV screen. I'm not saying the Virtual Boy necessarily succeeded with these concepts. I mean, it all worked fine enough, though it didn't light the world on fire. But it most certainly showed how they were possible, and you can see their innovations present in modern gaming experiences. The Virtual Boy only had nearly 24 games released for it worldwide, and was discontinued in 1996, less than a year after its debut. The 3D was honestly some of the best seen in gaming thus far, but does that really matter when you make 50% of these glasses worthless? Most of the Virtual Boy's shortcomings stemmed from cutting costs, like with the color palette and age restrictions. You probably shouldn't view this if you're under the age of 7. Well, yeah, you probably shouldn't drink and drive, but people still do it. So, what did we learn from the Virtual Boy?
Nothing.
Well, the failure of this console can show consumers didn't really respond well to a fully 3D game system. Stereoscopic 3D is an illusion. Many people can see it, but some just can't. And even those who can see it, it can really wear down your eyes and hand out headaches. So while the Virtual Boy did find far more creative uses for 3D in gaming than ever before, you couldn't turn the 3D off. Well, without surgery.
For Mario Clash?
It was completely impractical. This was a system made for a cheap 5-minute thrill, or look, the baseball's coming right towards me. I can do that for free. Not legitimate gaming experiences that players were expecting in 1995. I mean, most of the Virtual Boy's library consisted of titles that felt more like arcade games you played for 3 minutes at a time compared to the multi-hour experiences being released around then. No wonder this thing flopped. While it did have some merit, this was exactly what was wrong with 3D in gaming, putting 3D before gaming. However, that didn't deter Nintendo from pursuing this field even more. At this point, I don't know what would have. So the GameCube and Game Boy Advance were initially designed with some 3D capabilities in mind, more so the GameCube. Games like Luigi's Mansion in particular were tested with stereoscopic 3D, which makes a lot of sense. Each room in the game almost feels like you're peering through a dollhouse, so it definitely would feel right at home with the feeling of depth 3D allows. However, while the GameCube did have the necessary components inside it to display 3D imagery, like you can crack yours open right now and we'll find the technology required for such a thing, Nintendo opted to just scrap the feature for consumers, as it would have been far too expensive for a headset accessory and even a TV capable of 3D back then. It was always difficult for me as a kid to understand why sometimes 3D was expensive as it was, and other times it was included in a $5 Walmart DVD. Now, I definitely understand the type of 3D Nintendo was testing with the GameCube was much more robust and functional, while the cheap red and blue paper glasses made more sense for a picture book or something. But I think my childhood mentality of why is this 3D more expensive than this 3D is something many people had, which is why more elaborate expensive 3D devices didn't catch on too much. So how about some games that just support those cheap paper 3D glasses? What's the worst that can happen?
And these games are bad?
This type of 3D is called Anaglyph, and is generally one of the cheapest ways to achieve a 3D effect, as crude as it may be. You're not gonna get very lifelike depth out of these things. They work best with something like a comic book, and when you try to use them with media featuring heavy amounts of movement, the effect just doesn't work as well, and in addition to that, the original color palette is washed out and lost. But that didn't stop Konami from putting this feature in Contra Legacy of War for the original PlayStation. Ew! The game itself isn't good, and now I can't see it? Well, that's actually better. Slide 3 on the PlayStation 2 offered stages in 3D, of course being optional, viewable with glasses included within the manual. They even kind of look like Sly Cooper's eyes, which is a nice touch. Though both of these examples showcase how anytime Anaglyph 3D was featured in a game, it was always a complete gimmick with barely to no amounts of value. I need to do better research. In reality, there is one more notable use of Anaglyph 3D, and that's with Metal Gear Acid 2 on the PSP. Bundled in here is the Solid Eye, a foldable cardboard contraption that goes over the PSP screen to allow the player to view 3D images in-game. This is something you'd expect to see on a Nintendo console long before a Sony one, and honestly, I feel like you can make endless connections between this and the modern method of obtaining inexpensive virtual reality by folding together cardboard and sliding a screen in there. Metal Gear Acid 2 did this all the way back in 2005. What's your excuse? Featuring 3D, however, was hardly ever a great selling point. I mean, most of these games save the explanation for the back cover. It's obvious not many people really cared about 3D. If they did, there would be far more applications in gaming than there ended up being. I think we were all happy with the story ending there. Nintendo and Sega tried it, and nothing of note happened. In fact, it hurt their companies, if anything. And including paper 3D glasses was pretty much just a novelty. Most games that did it, they did it because they wanted to distract people from their game being as mediocre as it was.
What?
So by the year 2009, it was time to say goodbye to reality! 3D is back in the mainstream! With the release of the movie Avatar, setting box office records with the 3D edition being held in high regards as the version to see, everybody was all about 3D again. Every blockbuster film was releasing alongside a 3D version, with some making the 3D the core identity of the flick. Various classic movies were re-released in theaters in 3D. 3D TV sets were being sold as the next big thing, with 3D Blu-rays and 3D Blu-ray players being pushed right alongside them. Yep, it was a good time to be stupid. Now, the release of Avatar in late 2009 wasn't the true beginning of this 3D resurrection, as these 3D products were being developed and produced within the year or two beforehand. But because of that, the film's release couldn't have happened at a more perfect time. Trying to give consumers a reason for wanting this became a whole lot easier after they came back from seeing Avatar in 3D.
The hell was that?
So in came the 3D revolution, with Sony being one of the biggest supporters. I wonder why. The PlayStation 3 received a firmware update in the fall of 2010, enabling support for 3D TVs. And not everybody could experience 3D on the PS3. You had to own a 3D TV. I always see these logos on games this generation advertising 3D compatibility and cross my fingers when opening up the menus, turning on the functionality, thinking, once again, why wouldn't I just be able to use my paper glasses?
Why wouldn't I just be able to be myself?
Alright, this is a 3D TV, and not just any 3D TV, the PlayStation 3D display. Yes, a TV with PlayStation branding all over it, much like how Sony named a theater the PlayStation Theater. Is there any relevance to the name? Well, obviously not. By most accounts, the PlayStation 3D display is just a regular 24-inch 3D TV. You can use any console on it, and if they support 3D TVs, you can experience it with this set. You get these glasses which need to be recharged, which that right there sealed 3D TV's fate. Try explaining this to your dad. So not only is this not affordable like the paper glasses, but they need a power source, unlike the plastic movie theater glasses. I'm not disputing the need for power in glasses like these, but think of this from his perspective. This is my first 3D TV experience. It's also my last. This uses that active shutter technology, which is why the glasses need powered. The flicker between frames constantly helps maintain a high-resolution image. Those cheaper 3D glasses, yeah, they may not need power, but their method of creating a 3D image basically split the image in half, and in tandem, the resolution, so the image is much blurrier with these. So that's why we have glasses like these, and why 3D TV is a specific technology, even though, once again, I watched f***ing Shrek 3D on a portable DVD player in 2005. I know it's different, but I don't think consumers knew that. Well, here we go. A PlayStation 3 game in 3D. It's like I'm really there. You can only experience conventional 3D so many times before just going, yeah, I get it. Don't get me wrong, many of these titles that support 3D, they integrate it fairly well. The standout title here is MotorStorm Apocalypse, which was actually bundled with the PlayStation 3D display due to its use of Simulview, a feature on some Sony 3D TVs allowing for split screen without the split screen. Two people wearing 3D glasses would each separately see their own screen in multiplayer. No squished or cropped aspect ratio, no screen peaking. It was a notable idea. Only around 6 games supported the feature because 7 was woo. For the most part, 3D PS3 games were your standard affair. More depth in your image, nothing crazy. I mean, a game like Uncharted 3 looks good in 3D, but no way in hell I'd want to play the entire game like this. More PS3 games supported this than Xbox 360. You can tell by the dedicated logo on the PS3 titles compared to the arts and crafts project on every 360 release. But most of these games work fine enough in 3D. They just aren't at all necessary. It's cool to see how the gun looks in Killzone 3, extending a bit outside the TV, and how fighting in Mortal Kombat has so many layers in the background. But then you have a Sonic Generations to ruin your breakfast.
I don't buy it.
This is some of the most unrealistic 3D I've ever experienced. And that's not even accounting for the fact well, I don't think this is possible. But the 3D feels like it's layered incorrectly. Sometimes it feels like background elements are in the foreground, while the foreground is in the background. I've seen numerous elements in double vision, on top of the fact when the 3D is noticeable, it's not really that deep, both literally and metaphorically. Like, it barely sinks in, and it just doesn't have anything of value to offer. It makes the game harder to play, and when it works, it's not impressive in the slightest. Now, let's be honest. This product format is obviously an evolution of those original 3D glasses we tried out for the Sega Master System and Famicom, though you used active shutters as well. The problem is, this is not a big enough evolution. Comparing these two products, they have far more in common than you may initially think, and they're 20 years apart from each other, with this one being heralded as the future. Like, yeah, it's more advanced, but like, they're doing the same shit. Numerous console games from 2009 to 2013 supported 3D displays, none of which being all too necessary. It's like, yeah, Resistance 3 works fine in 3D, but who cares? You're not missing anything by not playing it in 3D. If anything, you're missing more by playing it in 3D because the image probably won't be as clear. Even with the most optimized games, double vision still pops up. But ever since 2013, it became so damn rare to see a stereoscopic video game release, which this just so happened to be around the time 3D was starting to go out of fashion again. 3D TVs were seen as a fad, not even a fad that really caught on, more so a fad that TV manufacturers were desperately trying to make a fad. I mean, none of this made sense for the consumer. Why would you want your living room to feel like a theme park attraction? 3D is a concept that works in small doses when you're out and about. Why not? I'll try this out, make it more of a fun evening. Not as the default way to consume content recreationally, which is why it's so interesting to see the most popular 3D device was f***ing hell again. Nintendo back after trying 3D. The Nintendo 3DS, the successor to the Nintendo DS, was unveiled at E3 2010, utilizing a screen capable of displaying 3D images without the need for special glasses. This was a big deal. The barrier between 3D and the rest of the world has finally been eliminated. Games can be in 3D without the hassle of needing to buy a 3D TV with clunky glasses. We can finally experience 3D normally as nature intended. The future for 3D content is bright, and Nintendo was leading the chart. So Nintendo was set to go all in with the 3D craze, being the focal point of their latest handheld, the product line that was one of their most important, and those first few years of 3DS advertising pushed it hard. No need for glasses, games more immersive than ever before. Games that were far more precise with the aid of 3D. While the Nintendo 3DS's main gimmick leaned a bit hard into Virtual Boy territory, so do I. But this felt like Nintendo truly learned some lessons from that experience. For one, you can turn off the 3D. You don't ever have to play with it on, or if you don't want to. And if you do play with it on, you can adjust the intensity on the fly. That would have been a great feature on the 3D TV's glasses. This is the most user-friendly application of stereoscopy that exists, and it works beautifully without glasses. Of course, you have to hold the system dead on for the effect to work properly, but if you do that, it'll work properly. And the games themselves, I mean, talk about the best uses of 3D so far in gaming. Super Mario 3D Land was designed around it, making it easier to properly land jumps. Kirby Triple Deluxe, Planet Robobot, Donkey Kong Country Returns 3D, and Mutant Mudds have you hopping between the foreground and background. Remakes like Star Fox 64 3D, Ocarina of Time 3D, Majora's Mask 3D, Xenoblade 3D all implement the feature beautifully and breathe new life into iconic worlds. I'd say Mario 3D Land may be the only example of a game that may need 3D more than it doesn't, but many titles on the 3DS utilized it quite well, and being a flick of the slider away gave the 3D effect way more of an impact than going through hell and back to play Sonic Generations poorly. Now, I can play Sonic Generations poorly because the 3D isn't the issue, it's the game itself that f***ing stinks. Luigi's Mansion received a sequel on the 3DS, Dark Moon, with superb 3D in tow. Like I said about the first game, the room-to-room camera angle made that game feel right at home using the gimmick, so a sequel coming to Nintendo's 3D handheld, it just felt like destiny. And then the original itself was remade entirely for the 3DS, so good for you, Nintendo! You fulfilled a lifelong desire twice! Why are you still so angry? Many 3DS games just have fine enough 3D effects, with a few having poorly implemented 3D and some just straight up not including it for whatever reasons. But the ones that knocked it out of the park, those were the games that truly made the 3D effect worth it. Not that much. Yeah, the 3DS was priced at $250 at launch, and after a successful first month, nothing. Well, that is if you count no sales as nothing. Nintendo had to slash the price just 4 months into the handheld's life. That is unprecedented. But once Nintendo wised up and focused more on the actual games, sales went up and kept going up. And by 2013, the 3DS experienced its most content-rich year yet. I mean, so many good games to play, and to celebrate, Nintendo gutted their child. The Nintendo 2DS, releasing just 2.5 years after the 3DS initially launched, got rid of the 3D display and a few other superfluous features to offer a much more affordable and kid-friendly product. And remember, 3D is not meant for the eyes of a child, so for Nintendo to sell a product that has a giant warning making it somewhat inaccessible to children under 7 with a new Pokemon game coming out,
What have we done?
and while 3D in the 3DS wasn't killed off with the introduction of the 2DS, it was obviously downplayed in the marketing for a bit there. The new 3DS and new 3DS XL revisions improved upon the 3D effect, utilizing eye tracking to ensure you don't need to hold the 3DS directly in front of your face all the time for the effect to work, and a few more big titles released, touting excellent use of 3D, like Metroid Samus Returns in 2017. But around that same time, more games were being put out without 3D at all on the 3DS, obviously because by this time, Nintendo knew most of the handheld's install base weren't playing with the slider up. So in the twilight years of the portable, when Nintendo was pumping out lower priority and budget software to keep it alive just in case the recently released Nintendo Switch bombed, they thought, why bother putting a good chunk of development time into a feature barely anybody was using? Yeah, 3D takes time and money to properly implement. It's a whole ass another realm to consider when crafting your project. And the 3DS was the best way to experience it. Easy, comfortable, non-intrusive, perfect. But because of how non-intrusive it was, as easy as it was to experience, it was even easier to just not experience it at all and just play a game normally. And the fact Nintendo didn't bring the feature over to the Nintendo Switch says it all right there. But 3D isn't dead entirely because everything it brought to the table, things flying in your face, being able to see depth in our games, it's all here in virtual reality. And let's be honest, if you're gonna ask us to put goggles on to be immersed in a game, just go all the way, man.
And you know what? I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I found 3D alone very seldom enhanced games. The only time I think it did was on the 3DS, and even then, the amount of games that truly benefited from the 3D being on was very limited. That doesn't mean the feature never had value, but if you're gonna use it, might as well go full-on virtual reality. So 3D gaming, it never really mattered. To Satan!